Iron is one of my favorite materials. I have been using it for the last 50 years. I've spent most of my time in factories and foundries, elbow to elbow with metalworkers, learning about iron in its different forms, learning to treat hard metals as it were a substance soft enough to fold, snip, or crinkle. Iron is one of the most common elements on Earth. Nearly everything contains a little iron. In the early 70s, John Deere invited me to work in their foundry. I had been invited because I had already been sculpting in iron, but in a very primitive iron foundry in a little town called Tierney, a man who cast lamp posts in iron. In Moline, Illinois, it was only after working at John Deere that I became addicted to iron. My Moline markers were based on my original steel tools that I used making wood sculptures or using them in my steel fabricating. I decided to recreate them and make them into sculptures. The tools were the sculptures. The models were first made in wood and then cast in iron. In John Deere, they have a whole department of people who simply make wooden bowls, but they're really done in the original. Very high-tech machinery. And that is what they cast everything they make. My tallest cast iron sculpture is Polygenesis, a 60-foot cast iron column for Houston, Texas, which came directly out of my experience at John Deere. When working with Polygenesis, I learned I could do almost anything in cast iron. And that's when I decided to make my Teatro Celli in Pistoia, Italy. My studio was covered in plaster. My hands were always white. The plaster models were cast into large square plates. They turned out exactly as my fingers had modeled the plaster, an exact copy. Watching those walls go up, plate by plate, was rewarding. I have always had an enormous affection for cast iron, but after doing those, I was in love. Palingenesis for the Credit Suisse outside Zurich. The word means one element seeds into another. And palingenesis represents the genesis of a cast iron column as it slowly moves out of a cast iron wall. There's always a pentimento of the last one into the next. I'm a great believer in the divine accident, and when these were cast, I realized that they really required many corrections. I wanted them to look more immediate. So I cut pieces out of them and weld them back in, a process which made room for the divine accident to happen. Though cast iron is heavier and more difficult for works as large as mine, it's just more beautiful. It gives the artist much more freedom of curve and texture. And it has a great history because it goes back to prehistory. The Manhattan Sentinels was one of the most interesting cast iron works I did, mainly because it was so huge, so monumental, and also that it was set in New York City, competing with the skyline. My 4 sculptures had to survive in that atmosphere. I wanted the hand to be evident. The originals were made of plaster, and they had to succeed in separating itself from the city and the impersonal skyscrapers and glass and cement buildings. I wanted this work to have a heart, to feel alive. And one of the things that helped was, while in work, after they were cast, they required many corrections. But it was a thrilling experience. Cast iron has a soul. It's because somewhere along the line, the iron has a mind of its own. You can't control all of it. Ductile iron is much more malleable and could be treated as if the metal were made of butter. The touch of my hand would show in the texture. Of course, I worked originally in plaster, so I was as fluid as I wanted to be. I like to treat each work as if it's a drawing, changeable, that I can do whatever I want as if it's only a scribble on paper, even if it's 40 feet high. Making the cast iron in plaster as an original was the perfect material to do that. A physicist once told me that everything has iron in it. A tear has iron in it. That everything eventually ends up with iron, or as iron. It's very satisfying to feel that you are cutting through time and using the oldest material that man invented it or found. And I hope you will enjoy very much working in this iron foundry. Thank you.